Everyone knew the holidays this year would be anything but normal, but it's fair to say that few anticipated that would include the resignation of the Minister of Finance after an ill-advised trip south. That as lockdowns came into effect across the province. COVID-19 case numbers kept rising, but vaccination rates, not so much. It's all put Doug Ford staring down tough questions as we embark on 2021. With us now to debrief this rocky start to the year, we welcome, in Burlington, Ontario, Laura Stone, reporter for the Globe and Mail's Queen's Park Bureau. In the Roncesvalles West End part of the provincial capital, Allison Smith, founder and publisher of Queen's Park Today and co-host of the Canada Land podcast, Wag the Doug. And in the Bay Clover Hill neighborhood, right near Queen's Park, there's Brian Lilley, political columnist for the Toronto Sun. And let me start by wishing everybody a Happy New Year. It's good to see you three again. Okay, well, let's get into this. Laura, when you heard the news that Rod Phillips was on vacation in St. Bart's, apparently against the advice being given to 14.5 million other Ontarians, what was your initial reaction?
My initial reaction was, this isn't going to be good. I think a lot of people were expecting some hard questions over the holiday break about, potentially visiting relatives or stopping by your parents' house outside. How are you going to celebrate Christmas? I don't think anyone saw coming, to the extent that we have seen in Ontario and across the country, the questions about travel internationally. And I don't think anyone would have expected a minister to actually hop on a plane and take a vacation. I think the interesting part of this story is how this news trickled out. I know that Brian and some other reporters were hearing potentially that Mr. Phillips was traveling, former Minister Phillips was traveling, trying to get answers about that. And then the initial defense from his office and the slow kind of demise of his political standing in the Ford government over several days. So I think there's still some tough questions to be asked on the part of Premier Ford, and he has not held a media availability since Mr. Phillips left cabinet, but he did admit in kind of a public statement that he had known that his minister was traveling and he did not immediately call him back. So it begs the question of who else in his office knew and why the premier did not force his minister to come back immediately.
Those are good questions. We're going to follow up on those in a second. But Brian, let me follow up on this first. You got rumblings that the former Minister of Finance was out of the country. Now, obviously, I don't want you to burn any sources, but how did this news dribble out initially?
It was being talked about all over the city by people who saying, I'd call somebody up for a different story and they'd say, I'm not in St. Lucia, because the initial rumor was that he was in St. Lucia. No, he was in St. Bart's, because apparently St. Lucia isn't quite posh enough when you're trying to keep up with the Kardashians and hang out with Chrissy Teigen and John Legend, which, I'm not sure Rod Phillips was actually there with them, but they were all in St. Bart's together, the playground of the super rich. So, his office just wouldn't say anything. It was days and days of denial and obfuscation. And then, as I'm taking some downtime, sitting at home like everyone else, it comes out that he's off in St. Bart's. This was absolutely bizarre. And then the comm strategy of just dribbling it out, as Laura was saying, was awful. Rather than just rip the Band-Aid off all at once, they put out a little bit at a time. Oh yeah, and he went to Switzerland in August, and oh yeah, he did this. You've got to get it all out there at once. I think his demise was partly their comm strategy, partly covering it up, like taking a sweater to St. Bart's to do a Zoom call. All of these things played into Rod Phillips' demise. And yeah, later this week, when Premier Ford does finally get out there and face questions, there's going to be some tough ones.
Allison, when something like this happens, immediately there is a huge discussion among people in the Premier's office, people in the Minister of Finance's office, elsewhere. What do we do about this? Does he have to resign right away, or is there some way we can skate through this? Was it immediately clear to you and the people you talked to that the only way out of this was a resignation?
I think the, real bad news for Rod Phillips on this happened to be the week that it happened. Most people in Ontario were home probably a little bored, and really ready to get angry about this. What Premier Ford did do was respond, with the resignation, although it was a slow dribble in some ways. It all happened within 3 to 4 days, whereas we have Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta, who waited until yesterday to have one of his ministers resign, who had been in Hawaii. It turned out 6 members of the government caucus had been traveling abroad there. So I do think in some ways, it wasn't the fastest move the Ford government's ever made, but it could have been slower. And you saw how quickly they had our new finance minister, Peter Bethlenfalvy, in the lieutenant governor's office getting sworn in. That happened on Friday. So I think they are trying to move past it, and it could have been worse for them if they did wait a day or two longer. However, the problem, for the PCs now becomes they are on their 3rd finance minister in less than 3 years in office. They need a budget out within a couple months. And now they have Peter Bethlenfalvy running 2 of the biggest portfolios, in the province. So it's not good for Ford, just on the managerial sense of running Ontario.
Well, let me follow up on that because, and Laura, this will circle back to the point you initially made. Premier Ford apparently knew that his former Minister of Finance was in St. Bart's. He knew it for a period of time, and yet he didn't do anything about it until the news became public. What do we think of all that?
Well, I think when you talk to those who are close to Rod Phillips, they say that he's the one to blame. He made the decision to go. It wasn't the Premier's decision, and so Rod Phillips should wear this. I think this raises larger questions about the protocol and the control that the Premier has over his own caucus and ministers. How can a minister just leave the country and ostensibly not tell anyone or tell very few people? And I take the Premier at his word until we know or hear otherwise that he did not know that Mr. Phillips had left the country until after he had arrived in St. Bart's. So it does kind of raise a lot of uncomfortable questions about what happens behind the scenes before it's revealed to the public and how much is covered up. I mean, surely the Premier would not have raised this publicly had it not been revealed by journalists.
No, that's the point.
And the media. Exactly. So how much happens that we don't know about? And so, is the Premier ultimately to blame for this? He is the leader and he does have to take responsibility. But Mr. Phillips was an extremely strong and prominent member of Mr. Ford's cabinet. He had a lot of power, and he obviously used that to his advantage in order to take this trip.
Yeah, Allison, I'm trying to explore what the Premier's responsibility is in this case. If, as he has said, he didn't find out about this trip to St. Bart's until after his former finance minister was already there, does he, when he finds that out, not have to say to Rod Phillips, get your butt back here right away, Buster? Do you know what this might do to our government if you get found out? He didn't do that.
He didn't. And I think another part of the St. Bart's trip that I particularly grilled the public was how long Rod Phillips was there. He got there on December 12th or December 13th. That's, weeks before Christmas. And he'd apparently been planning to stay until past New Year's. So, maybe does a minister need a little vacation? Sure. Maybe not abroad during a pandemic. Do they need a 4-week vacation? I don't think so. So you're right that the Premier, if you talk to the opposition parties, they want the Premier to really take a hit on this. And I think the fact that the Premier hasn't been, out in front of Ontarians for a news briefing since that happened, there's a reason why. He doesn't want to answer these questions, and he doesn't want to have to admit the fact that, his finance minister sort of betrayed him.
Okay, Brian, there's sort of 3 parts to this story. One is the original decision that former Minister Phillips took to take this trip to St. Bart's. The second part is the Premier's role in this, what he did or didn't do or should have done. And the third part is the absolutely bizarre communications approach that former Minister Phillips' office took by tweeting out pictures of him apparently working his riding while he was away or doing little pieces to camera wishing people Merry Christmas and Happy New Year in front of a fireplace while sipping on eggnog. I'm not meaning to be mean about this, but I am going to ask the question, why did it not occur to anybody in his office that this would clearly look like deceptive behavior and it was a dumb idea to do?
The most deceptive part to me, and you're right, Steve, he had all those tweets planned, and a politician can defend it or media people can defend it and say, well, you know, over the holidays, we always pre-program things. And I get that. And nobody expects a video Christmas message from their elected official to be actually broadcast live on their Twitter feed at 9:45 on Christmas Eve. No, we know that if that shows up, it's pre-recorded. But the biggest thing is something I already mentioned. He did Zoom calls with community leaders back home while he's in St. Bart's. And the Liberals put it out on Twitter saying, oh, you can hear the water behind there. I'm not sure you can hear the water. I'll leave that up for other people to debate. What is undebatable is that Rod Phillips had a shirt, a collared shirt, and a sweater on. The average daily high temperature in St. Bart's is 29. The low is 24. He planned to look like he was sitting in a warm, cozy office in Ajax somewhere or in his Rosedale home when he was actually in St. Bart's. That is the level of deception that the public couldn't stand. You know, as far as whether the premier knew or didn't know, I believe that he didn't know when Phillips went. So I'll believe him on that. And that's Phillips' decision. Ford didn't act, and this is what he has to wear. He didn't act in calling him back right away.
Laura, let's do one more question on this, and that is, I have heard people say that during the course of this pandemic, certainly starting maybe as far back as April, that Doug Ford managed to build some kind of bridge of trust between himself and the electorate that clearly had not been there in the first year and a half of his administration. What do you think the status of that bridge is, given the developments of the last week or so?
Well, I think certainly Premier Ford had a significant bump with the public, as you say, Steve, at the beginning, because he was out every day. He was answering questions. He was showing a side of his personality that maybe not everyone had a chance to see yet, because the media strategy early on in the Ford government had been to shield him from the public, and he had an acrimonious relationship with the media. And that did change. And I think that he did win over a lot of people who had not voted for him, or maybe thought, I don't know if I really would vote for him, but right now I'm supporting his leadership. I think, as you've seen in challenges with the vaccine rollout, certainly with long-term care and the way that the province has handled the second wave and the increased number of outbreaks that we're seeing there. And then with this latest trip, I do think there's a reason why Mr. Ford, Premier Ford, has not been in front of the cameras as much as he once was, and he has resorted to hiding away a little bit or not coming out as proactively as he once did, because he is now facing a much more disillusioned public and much more difficult questions than he had initially when this pandemic started.
All right, you mentioned the word second wave there, so let's pick up the story there. And Brian, I'll start with you on this one. We all knew a second wave was coming. It's been predicted since the summertime. It has been intense. How well do you think the province has planned in terms of its administration of vaccine rollout, long-term care homes, the whole gamut? How well are we doing in this second wave?
Well, much like the first wave, we're being hit hardest in long-term care. Look, there's a world of difference between the first wave and the second wave. Infection rates are much higher. That would be worrisome if hospitalizations and the worst outcome, ICU admissions followed by deaths, if those were trending in the same trajectory as infections. They're not. That's good news. So there's a few reasons for that. We've got better treatments, and that's not just Ontario, that's around the world. The hospitalizations are not rising at the same rate of infections, neither ICU nor death. That's the good part. But long-term care homes are still being hit hard, and we all know the reason why. People are carrying it in. The premier has said how many times, and that's why we're vaccinating frontline PSWs and nurses that work in these places first, is, you know, the residents aren't bringing COVID-19 into the homes. They're not going anywhere. It's out in the community, and that's, you know, the most vulnerable people for this virus are people that live in long-term care. That is the sore spot. I think that the province has done well on schools. I think that as far as the vaccination rollout, I don't think they were ready. They were planning for December 31st. They got the vaccine almost 3 weeks early, and I think it's showing up in the numbers. About 50,000 people vaccinated so far. That's good. It's not fast enough if we want to get to where we need to be come spring.
Well, we like to deal with empirically provable facts on this program, so let's throw some at you guys and our viewers right now. Sheldon, I'll ask you if you would. We've got a couple of graphs here that we want to show, and for those listening on podcast who can't see these graphs, I'll just describe them in some detail. We've basically got two sets of figures that we want to show here, and there's a vast blue area which shows how many vaccines have been distributed. And unfortunately, for the Canadian population, there is a massive gap between the amount of vaccines distributed and the amount of vaccines that have actually been administered. That administered number is a heck of a lot smaller than the number of vaccines that have been distributed. So there's a vaccine gap there, and that's a problem. Let's flip over to the next chart, and we'll follow that up with this. This is a bar graph that shows vaccine doses administered as a percentage of the population. And I guess not surprisingly, Prince Edward Island is first. They've got a fairly small, compact population, so they're easy to get the vaccine administered to. But look along the provinces there, Alberta, British Columbia, there's the Canadian average. Oh my goodness, Quebec, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, Ontario, finally, Ontario, well down the list of provinces in the country when you consider the percentage of the population that has had vaccine doses administered. And Laura, let me bring you in at this point and have you tell us what's going on here.
Well, that chart's really troubling, Steve, and a little surprising because I think the government put a lot of credence behind Rick Hillier as the chair of the vaccine task force. He came out how many times before Christmas and said that Ontario would be ready. They're going to treat this as a wartime exercise. I do agree with Brian that the government seems to have been a little thrown off by the timeline of when they received these vaccines, and there clearly are challenges with the Pfizer vaccine and where that needs to be stored. But this doesn't really jive with the way Premier Ford has talked about bureaucracy and red tape and thinking outside the box. I mean, why aren't more hospitals administering this? Why aren't the hours longer? Why aren't they bringing in various healthcare professionals to help out with it? Why are we kind of stuck in these silos of administering this vaccine in a way that is really limiting the number of people that are receiving it? I know the government is providing an update on this, and we're expecting them to take a much more aggressive stance on the vaccine rollout, but this is the only way out of this. It's the only way the province is going to come back to any semblance of normality, is to get the most vulnerable people inoculated from COVID-19. And the public is losing patience with the government and the pace of this.
Allison, what would you add to that in terms of helping us understand why the province appears to be somewhat more flat-footed in its response to all of what's been going on than it should be?
Yeah, I think what is glaring is the gap between, Premier Doug Ford was out on the tarmac at 4:00 in the morning in a reflective vest the day that the Pfizer vaccines first landed in Canada or in Ontario. But where is that urgency right now to get them in people's arms? We saw yesterday that the GTHA Mayors Coalition sort of suggesting that people can't even get to the vaccine distribution centers and that the province should be doing more to help people be transported to these places. Perhaps that's something that the province didn't think about. And when I think about the vaccine task force headed up by Rick Hillier, Doug Ford says he has so much confidence in this group. But then I think back to the provinces and the premier's health table that we were told, over months and months how much confidence he had in this group that was advising him. And then the Auditor General, Bonnie Lysyk, comes out and tells us that this health table in a lot of cases was, up to 500 people all on a conference call talking over each other. So, the vaccine task force, I don't have any details about what's going on the inside, but it's very possible that the actual bureaucracy and the way that these ad hoc groups are working on the day-to-day isn't as effective as they should be, or that Doug Ford is trying to tell us that they are?
Well, I guess, Brian, we should say, lest we leave this all at the feet of the Premier and Rick Hillier, I saw your piece the other day in which you suggested that there are public servants in the bureaucracy who, in your view, have not been helpful to the cause either. Why don't you just sum up that column for us, if you would?
Oh, I think that was on long-term care from a while ago. But look, all through this, there is an ongoing fight between bureaucracies and the government over how you get things done. Testing in pharmacies, asymptomatic testing of high school students, or in hot zones, or of people working in long-term care, all actually opposed by the health bureaucrats who are supposed to run the system. And it took politicians saying, no, we're getting it done. You're going to do it. We're in charge, to actually do some of those things, which were helpful. Well, now we need that for the vaccine rollout, because these silos that Allison was talking about, they're very real, and people become rigid and they say, well, this is the way we've always done it, so we have to keep doing it that way. No, we're in an emergency. We're in a pandemic. Break down those silos. Go after new ways of doing things. You've got some hospitals that are absolutely crushing it. Ontario, by the way, was being crushed by Quebec. I don't think PEI is a valid comparison. As you said, they're very small, but Quebec was crushing it. Ontario's catching up. We've gone from just about 13,000 a week ago to just shy of 50,000 now. That's a good improvement, but not good enough. How do we catch up? Well, new ways of doing things, have all the hospitals running full tilt, not having Ottawa be, at twice the rate of UHN in Toronto. These are things that can't be happening when one of the biggest health centers in the country, never mind the province, is lagging other parts of the province.
In the midst of that answer, Brian also introduced the idea that our long-term care home situation is something that we ought to look into right now. So, Laura, let's start some conversation about that. I guess the big news to emerge this week is that the people who are doing this sort of independent task force look at the situation in long-term care, they want some more time to get their report together. And the Minister of Long-Term Care has said, no, we're sticking to the original deadline. What's the verdict on that decision so far?
Well, the Commission had asked until December 31st, which is quite a long extension. The report is due at the end of April. So they were asking until the end of this year to get their report done. And I think that's simply to take into account all the details of the second wave and the way that the government has had or had not prepared homes for that, and as we're seeing kind of the devastating impacts of that. And they also say that the government has not provided them with enough information in order to complete their report. And we talk about the bureaucracy. The Ministry of Long-Term Care has to now go through hundreds and thousands of pages of documents and information to provide this to the Commission. But the Commission needs to do a thorough job to understand what has gone wrong in long-term care and how the government did or did not prepare for both the first and especially the second wave. I think that's particularly what the public views as unforgivable, that the government would not have been prepared the second time around, knowing full well the impacts on long-term care and the residents, and having various staff coming in, and we know there's staff shortages, and why weren't they preparing for that? From the government's perspective, though, having this independent commission was intended to speed this process along. We have gone through in public inquiries into long-term care, and they didn't want to drag this process out for years. So there's a push and pull there in terms of timeliness from the government's perspective, and the commission pushing for a more fulsome investigation of exactly what went wrong. I think the public would side more with the fulsome investigation, but they certainly aren't prepared to wait for 2 or 3 more years to get those answers.
Well, that's the thing. Allison, I guess we should just clarify for people, this is not a full-blown, public inquiry where there are lawyers for all sides and it's televised and you have witnesses being brought up and sworn under oath and so on and so forth. This was supposed to be, these are not the government's words, but this was supposed to be a kind of quick and dirty, let's get to the bottom of this and figure out what we can do going forward quickly. The fact that the government wants to stick to the original timeline, does that suggest to you that they are anxious to get these recommendations and get moving on them, or is there something else at play here?
I think the commission has three commissioners. They have been, doing a lot of public hearings, and we have been getting good information out of them. One of the things they fought for was the right for people to speak before the commission anonymously, out of risk of not losing their job. Right now, the SEIU of Ontario, a long-term care workers union, is calling on the commission to actually have the premier and Minister Fullerton, speak and before them and compel statements from them. I think if that happened, that would be a real game changer out of the information we get. But right now, we'll have to see what comes of it. In April, I think that is, too soon in a lot of ways. I kind of agree that the commission should have more time, because this scenario, this, disaster in long-term care is still happening right now. I mean, the question of last week, for a little while was, where in the world is Rod Phillips? The better question might be, where is Marilee Fullerton, the Minister of Long-Term Care? We have seen rising deaths in long-term care, protests outside sites such as Tender Care in Scarborough, where at least 60 residents have died very recently. And all we hear from Minister Fullerton is, these news releases she sends out every few days saying that another long-term care home has been handed over, its management's been handed over to a hospital. And, that keeps happening over and over again. Hospitals on their own are, dealing with COVID outbreaks and COVID wings, and now they're being asked to ever more frequently also run these long-term care homes. One of these homes just yesterday was on St. George Street, right downtown Toronto, less than 2 kilometers from Queen's Park. And we're just not seeing leadership from Minister Fullerton on this file. She's not talking to Ontarians, and she's not addressing these challenges, especially the staffing challenge, as it keeps progressing and keeps getting worse.
Brian, to the extent anybody remembers anything Premier Ford had to say about long-term care homes, it was this expression he used: we're going to put an iron ring around them, an iron ring of safety around them. How close are we to a set of circumstances where that iron ring is in fact in place the way you read it?
It wasn't in place in the spring, and it won't be now. I bet he regrets those words more than most others that he's spoken during this pandemic. But we have to be realistic. This is not to excuse the government of Ontario. You look around the world at who is hardest hit. You look at who dies from COVID-19. And it is disproportionately people with comorbidities over the age of 80, which perfectly describes people in long-term care homes. If you are, in your 70s or 80s and fit and healthy, as my parents are, your survival rate from COVID-19 is extremely high. It's very good. If you are dealing with underlying conditions and in a frail state, which is why you end up in a long-term care home, well, you're looking at about a mortality rate of between 25 and 29%. I'm not sure what any government could do to stop this. This doesn't excuse them. And as far as extending the commission, I think December is too long. We do need answers sooner, and we need action sooner, more than words. But sticking to April, probably not the best idea. Give them to June, give them to July. But if you continually extend these sorts of things, they go on to the point, Steve, how many times have we all covered public inquiries where by the time they wrap up, you forget why they were called. And then you've got, the public has to be reminded of why this was ever there in the first place. It's why I supported the idea of a quick and dirty one, as you said, but give them a little more time because we're still in the middle of this.
No, you make a good point. I think we all remember the child abuse inquiry in Eastern Ontario, which went on for a decade, I think, before the government eventually had to pull the plug on that thing. We've just got a few minutes to go here, and you're all politics reporters, so I want to get your political sense of where the government is right now. I mean, it was only a few months ago that this government was so popular that there was a lot of speculation that they might try to call an early election to take advantage of their unusually high popularity. I don't hear much of that talk anymore. Where are they at in terms of popularity right now? Laura, start us off.
Well, I'm sure there are many in conservative circles who wish that the government had called that early election, because that probably would have ensured another majority mandate for the Ford government. Particularly with some of the challenges that the opposition has faced throughout in terms of getting their voices heard and their messages, but that's getting stronger and stronger, I would say, as more of these problems are exposed. I think the biggest question for the government now is, do they stay the course, or does Premier Ford bring in even harsher restrictions in Ontario? I think that all plays into these travel stories and whether the public will is there to even listen to elected officials at this point. How much public will is there, and I also think that that Ontario has often followed the lead of Quebec, so it will depend on whether they do bring in things like curfews, which Premier Ford has resisted up until now. But this is a very, very challenging time for the Ford government. I think we're entering a dark January and February. We're going to have to see some more movement on vaccinations in order to get some of that hope back for the public. But right now, I think people are feeling pretty down and pretty disillusioned with where we're at in terms of the numbers of this pandemic and how we're going to see our way out of it.
Let's do a minute to Allison and a minute to Brian. Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the problem the Ford government is facing right now is what are their options for a good news announcement? The vaccine coming in was that. But it's all it's going to be for, the next months is, a very slow tick up those bar graphs that you showed us earlier, Steve. There's not a lot of opportunity for them to spin any of this in their favor, to divert bad news, through good news, which is something that political parties love to do. There's no, shining light at the end of this, at least until the spring. So I think there's going to be a lot of pollsters out there since the Rod Phillips issue trying to get an actual handle on what Ontarians are thinking about the PC government, but they're running low on opportunities to put the electorate in a good mood with their governance.
Last word to Brian Lilley.
Okay, so the most angry people over Rod Phillips and what happened there were PC voters and their backers. So that's going to hurt them in terms of popular support, especially among the small business community, which, as you know, will flip between liberals and conservatives based on any given election and what the issues are. But they've been losing the small business vote with these lockdowns because they feel that they haven't been getting the support they need, and they're taking the brunt of it. They also lost, I think, a bit of support that they were getting from the general public who hadn't been in their corner before, who felt they didn't lock down hard enough or soon enough. So the government's in a bit of a pickle in trying to say, okay, we're going to lock down, but not quite so hard. And then some people get nervous. Ontario's the most nervous province in the country when it comes to COVID-19. Ford has been skating along a very fine line on that, and he may have lost his balance the last little bit.
Our thanks to Laura Stone from the Globe and Mail, Allison Smith from Queen's Park Today, Brian Lilley from the Toronto Sun. Once again, Happy New Year, everybody, and thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.